works. Right now, I do want to bring in a friend of the show. We have him on quite a bit. We do have Casey Bergat to help break down what this means, what happens next, all of it. Casey, as always, thank you so much for being here with us. All right, it looks like you might be muted there.
I know. I learned my lesson. How dare I?
No, that always happens. I get it. So first off, kind of explain to me what this really means, because this was almost kind of expected, it seemed.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks expected it, but you never know with Supreme Court rulings, right? Especially with Donald Trump having several appointees to the highest court in the land. They've been giving him wins in the courts in his second administration, especially. But today was a ruling on tariff, something that a lot of folks had been waiting a long time for the ruling to come down, and it basically tells him he can't do it, at least in this way. This is obviously a huge underpinning of his economic policy. He's used it on adversaries and allies alike for deterrence, for leverage, for renegotiating trade deals, getting other concessions, really a broad swath of powers, all undergirding this use of the tariff power. And the Supreme Court says, I like that you are trying to do that, but it's actually Congress's job to do that. And the way that you're doing this, using a national emergency declaration of the trade deficit to give you this authority unilaterally across the board to decide on a Tuesday whether they go up or they go down, that can't be the economic policy here. And it can't come from the White House. That has historically come from Congress, and it must come from Congress again.
I have to imagine all of this happening right before the State of the Union. We're just a few days away from it. That's got to be a big topic that's likely to be discussed by the president.
Of course. And let's just say this president's not shy from letting his opinions fly, whether they're in formal remarks like the State of the Union or just as he'll ad lib throughout that speech. I haven't seen the president's response. I'm following this along as you are now. I can't imagine he'll take this lightly, but he's likely to reference not only the GDP number we saw today, but also the tariff policy, the wins that it created, the trade deficit impacts that it's had, and then maybe even mentioning the affordability problems that a lot of these tariffs economists have said have contributed to higher prices across the board.
There's obviously so many issues that are going to be discussed during the State of the Union. There's a lot of different topics. Do you think, on that same note, this kind of pushes it to potentially the forefront?
Yeah, they won't be able to deny it. They won't be able to hide from it, right? I mean, tariffs have been something the president has loved going back to all the way back to his first term. It is used for a bunch of different reasons, as I already mentioned, from leverage to deterrence, even forcing concessions on other policy areas with other countries that have nothing to do with our trade agreements, right? So this is something he has been able to use very broadly. He has taken that power and extended it. Which presidents are wont to do. So this isn't something that he's likely to just ignore going forward. He's going to respond to this ruling and then maybe even figure out through Congress, or probably not, given they have a lot of disagreements even within the Republican Party about tariffs and their usage. Can he institute these tariffs in another form? Can he rely on something other than the national emergency declaration he had before to go after at least some of the countries he wants to keep and impose these tariffs on?
And you are taking a live look there to your right. That's outside the Supreme Court building. Looks like, I would say normally we see a few more people out there when the opinions are coming down. Not that they really get any heads up or anything of that nature, but normally see a lot more. And also want to pop this up because we do have the actual opinion itself. We've been kind of combing through it. Like you said, following it in real time. Now, from what you've seen, and again, you probably have not had time to look through all of it, but what has stood out to you so far just from what you've seen?
Number one, 6-3 ruling, right? That not only did Chief Justice John Roberts, who if there's been a breakage of the conservative judges, it's usually been him, or at least recently been him. He was joined by Gorsuch and Barrett, I believe, to join with the liberal justices. So it wasn't a 5-4 decision. It didn't seem all particularly close. This is a sign that a lot of justices, liberal and conservative, agreed with removing this unilateral power away from the president. And then number two, in the quick excerpts I was able to read, that Roberts, who wrote the opinion, was very clear about where this power has historically come from and where it can come from again. He's not saying that tariffs should be illegal or not something that the president should have involvement with, but he should do it through the normal, typical legislative route, which is always and will continue to be through Congress. This declaration, this emergency declaration, sets a bad precedent, allowing occupants of the Oval Office to declare an emergency on anything and then associate economic policy through tariffs on what has historically been separated political and foreign affairs.
And I'll admit here, I am no expert on the Supreme Court. That's, of course, why we have the experts here. But to have the opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts there, does that tell us anything? Was that expected?
I don't know. I don't know. There's this informal back and forth about who writes what opinions, and usually it's folks who have wanted to mark their place on this particular topic. And the Chief Justice, obviously, when his name's associated with a ruling, particularly against a president of his own party, then it's a signal in and of itself, right? That he is not only one justice, but he is the Chief Justice, joining two conservatives and the other liberals on the bench to issue this ruling on behalf of the highest court in the land. So it's more a symbol and something that they internally go back and forth about who wants to be the one who stamps their opinion, their writing for history forevermore on this topic.
And I wanted to show you this live look. Right now, you can see one of the photographers has kind of stepped in front of the camera, but this is actually outside of the White House, as we could potentially get some comments here from President Trump, other members of the administration. We always have this camera that's kind of positioned outside. We know that President Trump is meeting right now with the different governors there. It looks like the shot may have froze, but also another question that a lot of people have is about this. Like, a lot of people want to know more. So we want to know what questions you have. All you have to do is scan that QR code at the top right-hand side of your screen. What questions do you have about the Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs? We want to know because, like myself, a lot of people have questions about what happens next here. And Casey, do we know much about what happens next?
I think so. We've been getting indications, particularly from congressional Republicans, that they want a way out of this tariff war. Not only does the uncertainty it brings with our allies and foreign policy, but a lot of consumers, a lot of producers here within the United States, it just makes things more expensive. I know there's debate about it on cable news circuits, but if you ask 100 economists, 99 are going to tell you that tariffs are taxes on Americans, the ones who purchase. They're going to pass those costs on. And so we're starting to see more and more studies about how much the Trump tariffs have actually impacted prices here in the United States. And if there's one issue that is driving people's attention and mostly frustration with government and policy, it's that stuff's too expensive, right? And so now we're starting to connect the dots, even on the conservative circles, not everyone, but enough of them, connecting the dots that maybe these Trump tariffs, something he has promised to lower prices and be this kind of cure-all for economic policy, is actually making things more expensive. Something that had plagued Biden before. This is a number one issue of why he lost the election. It's continuing under Trump, and the tariffs are not helping their cause. And so we recently saw last week congressional Republicans kind of push back on the president, where they have, not to go into the weeds here in Congress procedural nonsense, but they have basically removed, up until last week, removed their ability to override the president on tariffs. They basically neutered themselves on taking a vote against the Trump tariffs. And we can go into how they did that. It's pretty crazy how they did, but actually they limited themselves to rebuke their own president, mostly because they didn't want to have that fight, right? Republicans versus Republicans on an issue that really matters to the president. So they removed that power from themselves. Last week, they gave themselves that power back. And that's because enough rank and file Republicans have said, hey, we don't want to just not have an option here. Our constituents are paying more. Our constituents are more and more upset about the prices of things. If tariffs can help in any way, shape, or form, then we at least want to take a vote on it. The White House noticed that. That is something that Republicans had historically not done against this president. So the writing was on the wall that this is going to become more and more of an issue, and enough Republicans, given that the insecure majority is up there for congressional Republicans, enough Republicans are rethinking tariffs, or at least giving unilateral power to the president, who obviously wants to use these more and more.
And I have to ask here, because another big topic, the midterm elections, do you see this having any sort of impact on that overall? Not necessarily being a huge sticking point, but could this impact the midterm elections?
In so much as they affect affordability, right? The economy is just going to be the number one issue. It has been, it always has been. It's the economy, stupid, going back to Bill Clinton's advisor saying that. So prices matter here, and we know from economists it takes a while to have these broad economic policies, these global economic policies trickle down into everyday prices of what you and I pay for milk or for eggs at the store. We know they matter, but how much do they matter in my pocketbook, and when? We're starting to see that a lot of the president's promises in his first year haven't come to bear on economic fronts or price fronts as much as they tell you that the economy is doing well. There's a lot of disconnect between everyday Americans and what they feel and what they pay. And so tariffs, yes, mostly because I think, I'm making a guess here, that the president is not going to let this go. Right, that he's going to continue to ask for more tariffs or blame the Supreme Court. He's not going to just let this slide. He's going to draw attention to this issue, which is going to put congressional Republicans in a tough place of defending their president because they know how important he is to the Republican Party, but also acknowledging the cost and the affordability crisis that a lot of constituents, even on the Republican side, especially on the Republican side in many districts, are yelling and frustrated with their own representatives about. Right. So it's kind of one piece of the economic puzzle. But as much as the president has talked about it and will continue to talk about it, I think it's going to remain a big piece in that affordability economic discussion.
All right. So we, of course, want to know what questions you have about the Supreme Court's ruling here as they strike down President Trump's tariffs. All you have to do is scan that QR code, top right-hand side of your screen. And, of course, we will bring in a panel of experts here to break down some of those questions. And I'm sure there are a lot of them there. We, of course, have this question here that's coming in from Anthony. And, Casey, I'm not sure if you can speak to this at all, but this person asking, what is the difference between Trump's tariffs and other presidents' tariffs?
Yeah, let's try here. And so the country has a long history of tariffs. Before we had income tax, and one of the main ways we brought in federal revenue was on import, right? When the Coast Guard brought in things that were shipped overseas, we brought them in and we taxed it. It was a way to basically fund our federal government. That went away, or at least lessened the reliance on those tariffs to fund our government after the income tax was established. And then there was a huge knockdown, drag out fight with presidential tariffs in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, right? This is something that if you're really bored, go check out on Wikipedia, because this is the last time Congress was really frustrated with a president being unilateral about what he decided to tariff on what and on whom. And so I think what's striking about Trump and his tariffs, number one, is that he put them on almost everything. Right? It was usually tariffs were targeted. They were targeted to specific industries, certain products, things that had national security implications, things just more targeted. These were across the board, right? And on Liberation Day, he literally just put a flat tariff on everybody, enemy, ally alike. It really frustrated, upended kind of the global order that we have more or less taken for granted since World War II. And so that's a huge striking difference in not only scope, but in just unilateral today. And then another big difference, I think, in previous administrations and these tariffs is just how much they've changed, right? Like we can wake up on a Tuesday and they have been doubled or tripled by tweet. Right? Like it's just been an economic leverage point for the president to make people do what he wants. And that's just historically not how presidents have viewed tariffs. If they wanted to put them on at all, they were more targeted and more on protection of U.S. mostly manufacturing basis, rather than I'm going to use this the power of the pen on an economic front to make you Canada or Mexico or someone else do something that may or may not be connected to economic policy at all or trade deals at all. And then the final thing I'll say is the emergency declaration. The fact that Trump has been able to institute these tariffs is because he declared a national emergency, a national security threat because of the trade deficit. And we can have a back and forth about whether that is a national security concern or that's just an economic policy concern that needs to be addressed. But that's what he used to be able to apply these tariffs across the board, across industries, on allies and enemies alike.
And of course, if you have to go, Casey, let me know at any point. Just let me know here, because I know we're keeping you for quite a bit. But want to pop up some of the other questions. This looks to be more of a legal question. Not sure if you can speak to it, but it says, what are the legal and constitutional implications of President Trump continuing to impose and collect tariffs despite a Supreme Court ruling against them?
Man, Ricky, good job. This is the next question, right? For nerds like me of like, all right, what happens now? And I haven't had a chance to read the ruling of if they give any indication of when these have to be peeled off, if they are basically declared null and void effectively now, what happens to imports that are coming in the ocean? I don't know these very technical answers, but if he let's say that they didn't give a hard deadline. Actually, let's make it simple and say they did give a hard deadline. As of right now, they don't no longer apply. And the president and his administration continue to enforce them as if they do. Now we're talking about what a lot of legal scholars have been fearing for a long time, particularly with this administration, is do they just outright flaunt a Supreme Court ruling? I don't know. That's for a lot of folks the definition of a constitutional crisis, because the highest court in the land, there's no more appeals to be had, right? They made their ruling on a 6-3 basis. And I haven't read it, but depending on how specific they are and how this has to be unwound, if they continue to flaunt it, then you're basically just putting your thumb in the eye of the Supreme Court. And then it's going to become up to Congress to respond about how willingly or not the president is following the Supreme Court ruling. So this is uncharted territory. We haven't gotten there yet, but for a lot of folks, that's the definition of a constitutional crisis: is you get a clear ruling from the Supreme Court with a hard deadline and no wiggle room, no gray area in enforcement. And then the administration basically says, nah, I'm good. Thanks. I'll try my own way still.
And before we get back to maybe some of the questions there, wanted to ask what questions you have specifically. We've kind of gone over that a little bit, but I'm sure you described yourself, I believe, as a nerd. So I'm sure you're paying attention to all.
How dare you, Josh?
Right. I would never call you that. That was a quote.
The big one for me is the unwinding, right? Like it's very clear that they struck them down, and then there's like, I'm always fascinated, especially when we deal in $1 trillion budgets and 350 million, the global economy, right? Like it constantly is churning. So when you throw in a wrench like this, how do you logistically unwind it? Is it today? Are they null and void? Are there communications? Do we renegotiate trade deals that were like, there's just so much here. So my number one question is, how specific was the ruling, and what did they recommend, if anything, about what to do with the tariffs that are on right now? Do they have to leave within 30 days, or are they vague in their language of shall unwind or something like that? I don't know yet, because I haven't had time to read the ruling itself.
I can't believe you haven't had time to read it. It's only
you got in my way, man.
Pages long. Yeah. All right. And one more question here before I let you go. Just want to pop it up. This is actually a question that you just kind of touched on, and it's the overarching question as we pop this up here. How is this ruling going to affect us?
We won't feel it immediately. We're going to feel it and see it and definitely hear it politically with the volume that's going to be attached to this issue. Conservatives mostly are going to blast it, particularly from the White House. Democrats, I'm sure they already issue statements saying that this is a win and something that they knew was unconstitutional before it ever happened. So we're going to hear it politically. That's going to affect us just psychologically and with our polarization and partisanship. But in terms of like prices, it's going to be a while. The same way just now we're getting the economic data that is proving once again that tariffs ultimately raise prices, but they don't do it immediately. They do on certain producers here, or you hear stories about farmers that can't compete or that they're paying more. That is like the individual kitchen table issues if you're immediately and directly impacted. Tariffs in terms of economic policy, any economic policy and monetary policy, takes a while for that, always hear this, the trickle down effect to go into place, right? And so we may not, assuming they just throw them off and prices are going to adjust, there's going to be some backs and forths with trade deals to do this. You're going to feel it in the stock market. But even here, you have some counterintuitive findings here, right? It's up 150. So this is Wall Street basically saying, in the end, this will be a good thing. That tariffs are out of play here. So you won't feel it immediately. And in terms of prices, your guesses are as good as mine, because it's not just as simple as, hey, tariffs are gone, let's lower them back to a pre-tariff world. We know it's never that simple or that quickly.
All right, Casey Burgatt, thank you so much for taking the time, as always, to be here with us. And I didn't plan to pop up the stock market as you spoke about it. That was just coincidence right there. Anything you want to add, anything we missed here before I let you go?
No, just I mean, as the Congress defender here, a pretty indefensible institution too often. Like you can do tariffs. There's a right way to do tariffs. We can debate about if they're good economic policy. Though a lot of folks disagree on that. But you can use them as certain leverage plays. But historically, if you want them to exist and you want them to be stable and you don't want to make mad the wrong people in the world, then you got to go through Congress. They're more stable, they're more permanent, they're more well thought out, and you're not subject to the president's feelings on any given day about how he's responding to certain crisis or negotiations throughout the world. So Congress and our country have a long history with tariffs. If you love them, if you want them, if you want them permanent, then do it the legislative route, the way it was supposed to work, always, always, always through Congress. But good luck with that. They have trouble enough keeping their own lights on.
All right, Casey Bergat, thank you so much as always for taking the time to be here with us and breaking it all down. We definitely appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And of course, we are going to continue to bring on several different guests as we break all of this down for you. What I want to do is read to you some of the other reaction as we approach the top of the hour here. Former Vice President Mike Pence saying today's 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court is a victory for the American people and a win for the separation of powers enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. In Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, our Supreme Court has reaffirmed that the Constitution grants Congress, not the president, the power to tax. American families and American businesses pay American tariffs, not foreign countries. With this decision, American families and businesses can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm proud of the work our organization, American Freedom, has done on this case through our robust amicus brief program to advance economic freedom and defend the Constitution. With this historic decision, America can now return to the pursuit of free trade with free nations under the Constitution of the United States. Again, we are talking about a lot of reaction that is coming in from all over at this hour as we continue to follow all of the developments here. Again, we have now learned the Supreme Court just about an hour ago released that decision where they struck down President Trump's sweeping tariffs there. A lot of different reaction is continuing to come in here, so we're going to bring you all of that on Live Now from Fox as we get it. Right now, though, we do also have several experts that are joining us throughout the morning and into the afternoon, I imagine, as we break down exactly what all of this means as far as the situation itself, how it's going to play out. What I want to do is bring in some of our friends here who you see a lot if you watch us on Live Now from Fox. You do have Jeremy Rosenthal as well as Gerard Filitti. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Pleasure.
All right, so what we're going to do is take a look at just some of the different questions that we are getting in from folks out there as we want to know what they think overall. But first, wanted to check in with both of you to get your overall reaction here. We'll start with you, Jeremy.
I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised. I think the opinion is fairly clear-cut, and it turns on what's called the major questions doctrine. The power to levy tariffs is very clearly to Congress. That's expressed in the Constitution. And any time that one branch is going to delegate that type of a power to another branch, it's got to be very, very, very specific. The statute that the Trump administration was relying on is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and it's called IEEPA. And IEEPA has never really been used for tariffs. It was enacted in 1977, maybe in regards to some of the OPEC crisis, President Carter. So I think the legal pathway I think it's a fairly clear-cut proposition of law that the president just can't throw out a tariff like a lightning bolt just because. That said, this court has been very reluctant to step on the president's toes. In fact, Brett Kavanaugh, in his dissent, gave Donald Trump a roadmap how to get out of this, which that's some legal advice I'd like sometime from a Supreme Court justice. So I'm surprised in some ends and not surprised. This is a major, major defeat for the Trump administration in the Supreme Court, the likes of which he's not seen probably in his second term.
And Gerard, you and I have discussed quite a few times the actual overall implications of the tariffs, all of that here, legally speaking. Want to get your reaction as well.
Well, I think this is the Supreme Court reinforcing very clearly the separation of powers and reading statutory language in the manner that it was actually written and intended by Congress. In this case, as Jeremy said, this was a very limited act. IEPA is very limited in not allowing tariffs. Those are not mentioned in that law, in that statute. And the Supreme Court very correctly, as many of us expected, ruled that President Trump could not use that as a basis for the sweeping tariffs that he imposed. That being said, I think that the impact here will be reverberating through the economy for a while. And if anything, it might create a little more uncertainty than we already had in the economy because Trump has indicated that he does want to continue pursuing tariffs and that he would potentially use other means, whether it's as laid out by Justice Kavanaugh in the dissent or by other ideas that President Trump has. So the idea of tariffs being in place is still there. The question now becomes, how do companies get refunds for the tariffs that they've paid? And what can the economy anticipate next in terms of future tariff attempts?
And that's, of course, the question is what happens next? Are there going to need to be refunds? So many questions that are up in the air. So we're actually handing it over to our Live Now from Fox viewers to get their questions. And I want help from both of you because I am no expert on any of this. That's why we have you in here. Let's pop this up right here. This is one of the questions. And of course, whichever one of you wants to take this is Ricky M., who says, what are the legal and constitutional implications of President Trump continuing to impose and collect tariffs despite a Supreme Court ruling against them?
So I think here, to answer this question, and a little bit to what the last speaker was kind of talking about in terms of constitutional crisis, this is not really a red light that I think the Trump administration can run. And it's not that they might not want to. It's that I don't think they can. I think Canada or China or some of these other countries, I just don't think they're going to pay the tariff. And I think that they're going to say, well, Mr. President, this was illegal, and now you owe us money in return. And that may turn into a fight. Where you get a constitutional crisis is when you look at some of, some of the deportations, right? The plane's in midair on its way with somebody over the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, depending on where how you see it. In that instance, the executive is ordering the military to take certain actions. Here, I don't know how the Trump administration would try to violate this order because so much of the control of what happens with the tariffs is out of the executive's hands. This is money that's exchanging hands from other countries to the United States or from companies who are importing these things, and they're just not going to pay it if it's illegal.
And very quickly, I'd also like to point out that IEPA is not the only basis that President Trump has to impose tariffs. Some of the tariffs that already exist, such as against Mexico, are enforced by other legal mechanisms which were not challenged and which the Supreme Court did not throw out today. So some of these tariffs remain and they're constitutionally valid insofar as they have not been challenged yet.
And I was going to say, feel free to interject and, talk amongst yourselves as well. We have plenty of time. We want to make sure that we're answering these questions for folks out there. Now, if you do have a question that you, at this point, want to ask, just scan that QR code, top right-hand side of your screen, or go to livenowfox.com/connect. It'll say Ask Live or Ask Now, and that way you can just type in your question. Make sure you put your name and where you're from, just your first name, though, so we can make sure to put it up here on the screen. All right, so we're going to go to the next question here. Looks like we have Gabriel L. in Corpus Christi. Gerard, how is the ruling going to affect the future of potential manufacturing jobs in the U.S.? Is that something that you're able to answer?
It is, because I do happen to have a degree in economics as well as law, and this is where it comes in handy. I think that we will see President Trump continuing to push manufacturing in the United States to pick up, to increase. We're seeing new plants that are opening, not just because of tariff pressure, but because of the way that Trump has handled bilateral deals with other countries. So we do see President Trump pushing the continuing rebuilding of America's manufacturing sector. Now, these tariffs also, the tariff mechanisms that still remain available to the White House, include tariffs for unfair trade practices, which means that a country is imposing sectoral tariffs on products that are being imported there. This is something that if President Trump can continue maintaining under separate authority, which means that American products will have a benefit, will have more impetus to keep jobs in the United States, to build those products that we could now sell overseas. So I don't think that this puts a dent in the manufacturing process here in the U.S. And I think President Trump has every intention to continue pushing for more manufacturing domestically.
And of course, now, Gerard, I know I can ask you all kinds of economic questions now that I know that you have that degree as well. Jeremy, anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't have an economics degree, so I'm not quite as well situated as Gerard to answer these. What I can say is that what the courts will say is this is not the court's problem. And one of the things that happened in oral argument here is that the government conceded, look, you guys strike this down, this is going to be a mess. And that's exactly as far as sorting out what's going to happen with the tariffs next. It's going to be a mess. We don't know because all the court's empowered to do is to rule on the facts in front of it. Either the tariffs are void or they're not. And the court decided that they're no good. So what is that? What type of mess is that for everybody else? We don't necessarily know. And are there other avenues for the president to try to advance his agenda? Certainly there are. Gerard spoke to them, and we see some of it in the opinion that we've already kind of talked about, other end arounds that the president can try to use. And again, when we go back and we look at that statute, IEPA, again, the major questions doctrine says that if one branch of government is going to delegate to another, it's got to be very, very, very precise. And IEPA just doesn't talk about tariffs. It just doesn't. So the president's going to have to find some other type of legal authority. And another point here that I think is in some ways more a political one, Donald Trump is all about pressure points, and he's all about leverage. He was that way when he was a real estate mogul. And he's that way with the Republican Party. And tariffs were his mechanism to punish other countries for not doing what he wanted. And even in circumstances for foreign policy about you let us fly over your airspace or you're going to get a tariff. So this is a major, major blow to the Trump administration. Because now he's going to have to find different legal avenues to impose those tariffs. And not only that, other countries aren't going to take the threat seriously anymore, even if the president does have legitimate basis to impose those tariffs, in some instances unilaterally.
And I didn't think about that. That makes sense that, of course, now if you have him saying we're going to put tariffs on you, we, of course, have the Supreme Court saying, no, you're not. So that's interesting to kind of factor in here. And I'm not sure, do we have any other questions that we can pop up here? I'm sure a lot of folks have a lot that they want to ask. We have Art who's saying, what happens to the tariffs that were already collected? We don't really know, right?
Well, I think what we can expect is a lot of companies that paid tariffs. So because tariffs are ultimately paid by companies who are importing into the United States, where the settled product, where the settled trade of the product occurred. So you have companies in the United States that paid these tariffs, and a lot of them, the major players, think Costco, for example, they filed challenges to these tariffs in the Court of International Trade. So those cases are pending. Now that we have the Supreme Court saying that these tariffs were unconstitutional, the Court of International Trade is likely to say, okay, you win your case because the Supreme Court said so. Now let's see the amount of money that you're entitled to have refunded. So a lot of companies already filed challenges in the Court of International Trade. We are likely to see a lot more lawsuits brought in the Court of International Trade. And there's also a refund process with Customs and Border Protection, where you're filling out paperwork and forms for things that have not yet been paid tariffs on. So this will generate a lot of work for lawyers and judges and other courts. But the process, I think, is fairly straightforward as to how it happens. The amount of time it takes, that's a different story.
Jeremy, anything you want to add there?
No, the only thing I was going to say, and Gerard hit it before I did, this is the lawyer stimulus package. This is going to be the gift that keeps on giving to corporate and international lawyers everywhere. This is just going to be a mess. And and it's going to take a minute to sort of unwind and unpack these. And to some degree, if the administration can find legitimate tariffs going forward, the president can still say, well, not so fast. You know, you're not getting your refund so fast. If you don't do this, that, or the other, then I'm going to hit you with something else. So there is going to be some jockeying, I would expect.
And we're going to ask one more question here in just a second. We are checking in with our different viewers, trying to see what you want to know, what you need to know about all of this here. And if either of you have to go, let me know, because we've been keeping you for quite a while here. What you're looking at is outside of the White House. This is where the microphones are set up. Not quite clear if we're going to get reaction from anyone within the Trump administration about this. We have already heard from President Trump, who is essentially calling this a quote-unquote disgrace. So we expect we will get a longer statement from him coming up soon. Right here, though, we do have another question. It says, can President Trump still impose tariffs, or is this ruling binding and final?
To kind of go back, Justice Kavanaugh did talk about some different avenues that the president could use. And in one instance, he said, you just checked the wrong box, Mr. President. Some of those include different tariffs, different powers that the president can use. Again, the question is has Congress specifically given the president the power to do so? The law that the Congress that Donald Trump and the administration was using, IEPA, that would be the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, simply didn't do that. Justice Kavanaugh referenced the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the Trade Act of 1974 as some possible alternatives. So the Trump administration is going to have to find some end arounds here. And it sounds like they've at least got one vote in the Supreme Court that's going to uphold them the next time around.
And one thing to add to that is there are these workarounds, there are these other statutory bases for tariffs, but the difference is that it's much harder to impose those by executive order because all of them require some type of investigation or finding by a body within the administrative branch. The Trade Expansion Act, I believe it's the Commerce Department, the unfair practices, you're looking at the U.S. Trade Representative. So you're looking at different agencies that have to investigate these foreign practices and come to a conclusion that they are harmful to U.S. interests before the tariffs can be imposed. And even then, some of them are only of limited duration or limited to a specific product or products. So these will not be sweeping tariffs at a set rate across the globe or across the country. They will have to be much more targeted, and they will have to follow a regulatory process, which, as we've seen in other instances with the Trump administration, that's not always what he likes to do.
All right, so what I want to do now is kind of give you guys a chance to go over anything that we may have missed. Obviously, we covered a lot of ground here, but we'll start with you, Jeremy. Anything that you want to make sure to add here before I let you go?
I think what's important for folks to understand is that this is, I would be shocked if this didn't already impact the stock market. I haven't looked. This interjects a ton of uncertainty into this administration's way of conducting business. And so in some ways, I do think that President Trump's going to find some different ways to impose and levy some of these tariffs. But the economic uncertainty is, I think, going to be pretty palpable. Also, from a legal standpoint, we simply haven't seen the U.S. Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, we haven't seen them stand up to Donald Trump in this way, at least not yet. So I think that if there's any kind of takeaway news, it's that. I believe that the justices, it was a 6-3 opinion. It's what's called a plurality, and it's a 170-page opinion. And what that means, what a plurality opinion means is that different judges signed off to different parts of it. They didn't all agree on the whole thing. It wasn't 6 agreed to everything and then 3 disagreed. It was more piecemeal. But the justices who were loyal to the president were Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Alito, and Justice Thomas. But you had Amy Coney Barrett telling Donald Trump he was wrong. You had John Roberts doing the same thing. Obviously, Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Jackson's, the ones you would think that would side against the administration did so. So I think from a legal standpoint, there's a lot to be to sort of take heed here of, and what I'm curious to look at going forward, because so many of the cases that have come across the U.S. Supreme Court's desk involve executive authority and expanding executive authority, and we've seen it time and time again. So now that you've got the Supreme Court showing that they're willing to stand up to President Trump, at least in some ways, we'll see if that trend continues. That's kind of what I'm looking for next.
Jeremy, and before we get to you, Gerard, I wanted to point out, I was saying earlier that I thought maybe the opinion was fairly short, but I think it's so long that it actually broke our printer. So that's all we were able to get out of that. But Gerard, anything you want to add here before I let you go?
It's 170 pages and well worth reading. I think one thing that I would add is when you look at the justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, one thing that they did not join on was in the major questions doctrine part of the decision. They were looking at this strictly from statutory interpretation. So it's interesting to see that even within this 6-3 split, there still is the more liberal justices don't want to go down the path of major questions because in part they support a lot of the regulatory and agency actions that the Supreme Court has struck down over the past few years. So that's a tension that we will see continuing in the court. And to Jeremy's point, the stock markets do seem to have rallied. Everything seems to be up. And businesses like the fact that now there is more certainty, at least that these tariffs are not going to continue going forward.
And I was going to say the stock market right now up about 82 points. So it appears it's doing pretty well, talking, of course, just about the Dow.